Well, a funny thing happened on the way to the indictment. A grand jury set up to investigate Planned Parenthood and whether it was illegally selling fetal tissue for profit. Remember this? Well, they wound up indicting the anti-abortion activists who were out to get the woman's health group shuttered. Now, those activists, they posed as workers from a biomedical company and secretly shot video of their dealings with Planned Parenthood. Now, they recorded officials discussing the fetal tissue and how companies used it for research. Now, some of the Planned Parenthood workers, they came off as insensitive, to put it politely, but the grand jury said they didn't do anything illegal. Instead, the filmmakers are charged with tampering with government records. Against better judgment, I will start with Mr. Furnish. First of all, have you ever seen anything like this where the whole thing starts and the person on defense, in effect, maybe they'll get acquitted, whatever, but instead it's not the plaintiffs, but the perceived people who brought the action that are now the ones answering to the law?
Well, I don't know what Texas criminal procedure is, but I imagine this was an investigative grand jury, what they call an investigative grand jury. So what the DA did, who, by the way, is a hardcore Republican, staunch opponent of abortion, and yet she's being commended for giving a fair and open-ended presentation and letting the grand jury do what they will and not trying to unduly influence it. So I imagine she took the whole pile of facts, dumped it in their lap, and the investigative grand jury's lap, and said, do with it what you will. So they have the power to find the facts and charge whomever they want.
So you know the difference between what Mark is talking about in the indictments and presentations we usually talk about. Usually a prosecutor says, all right, I'm going to indict this person. They go into the grand jury and they say, I'm going to present evidence with regard to the case against this person, look at the evidence and make a decision as to whether you want to indict or not indict this person.
Right.
That grand jury doesn't have the option of saying, well, you know, I'll tell you what, we're going to indict somebody else.
But when I read this, Jimmy, is there a risk to this where you basically dump it in the lap of the grand jury, but doesn't most grand juries need a little direction as to what they're looking for?
Well, that's the difference. With an investigative grand jury, they're told essentially what their purpose is and what their mandate is, and they're told, we're going to give you all of this evidence and you are going to make a determination as to whether certain crimes were committed or not committed. That investigative grand jury can come back to you and ask you some questions about certain crimes and so on and so forth, and you'll give them further direction, but they have the option of, there's no target.
You do whatever you want.
It's a case, it's an investigation, and they're not given specific targets, so to speak, to consider. They're not limited in that way.
Sometimes they'll even just issue a report.
Right. That's right.
Yeah, that's right.
But they can make
recommendations.
recommendations. And when they make the recommendations, they can ask for guidance. They can make recommendations that certain charges be brought.
Were you guys surprised? I mean, if you saw the genesis of this, at least for the public, it was these recorded videos. And then we found out that they were edited, and then how they were recorded in the first place and brought to light. And obviously, there was a lot of politics involved in this, a lot of shock that was attached also to what was also recorded in the first place. But nonetheless, did anybody see at the time, you go, whoa, these guys might be in trouble. They surreptitiously recorded all this stuff without knowledge or whatever, and they went in with an agenda and did everything else. Did anybody think these guys were looking at criminal exposure at the beginning of this?
Yeah, I don't think anybody comes off looking good in this kind of situation. It's such a political football.
Yep.
Whether you're a supporter or an opponent of it, it's the life of something, whatever it is. And it's so politicized, and I think both sides come off looking really disgusting in the whole thing. And from the Republicans to keep mining this territory when it's not a successful strategy for them, to keep harping on it, it's just going to blow up in their faces. Maybe somebody will get nominated in a primary, but you're going to need normal, centrist, moderate people and independents to come with you, and this isn't going to work.
But that being said, it surprised me because generally, again, when you have a grand jury, even an investigative grand jury, you're given a certain amount of information and there is still a desired result, desired outcome. I've had cases where we had people who we thought were the victims and we later learned during an investigation and an investigation that continued after the arrest that person was not the victim, and in fact that person was the perpetrator. So we withdrew charges against the actual person who had been charged and charged her. But that's a different situation than a grand jury where they have enough information and somehow they determine not to go forward against which really in my mind still was the target, which is Planned Parenthood, and they take that extra step to recommend charges against the people who brought the evidence.
But Houston, unlike the rest of Texas, right, is traditionally a Democratic voting bloc, isn't it?
Yeah, but I wouldn't expect, even if that happened in New York, for the
Yeah.
people to get charged. I think that it was
Right.
extraordinary.
Right. But
And Houston is an interesting demographic because you've seen people from both parties elected. You saw the first openly gay mayor
Right.
in history even elected there, but also you've seen it as home bases for a lot of the Bushes. So
yeah, and this DA is hardcore Republican,
Which
and the
is
lieutenant
refreshing.
government is.
Which is
Yes, it
refreshing
is.
after all
Yes,
the
it is.
discussions we've had here about the need for special prosecutors, which I don't back off on, but it is refreshing to see that somebody with such a strong political background is able to go to a grand jury
and I'll be
say,
fascinated
"Here it is."
personally, what happens in the next election cycle?
Interesting,
Will
yeah.
they be praised for being nonpartisan, or will it be held against it, especially when you're a law enforcement
Well,
official?
praised by their adversaries and condemned by.
And sometimes that's the worst thing that happens if your
Yeah,
adversary
exactly,
praise you.
exactly.
Okay, coming up next, much closer to home. If a cocktail waitress packs on the pounds, can her employer tell her to pack up her things and say goodbye? Believe it or not, a court has just ruled that the answer is yes if that employer is the Brigada in Atlantic City.